That's the only thing I know is that you just do it.
Yeah.
Okay, now it's on. I always get confused by
we're live.
it's not actually on the live because of the delay, but whatever. Anyway, the point of these videos is just to make legible who actually works on this project, because otherwise we're all sigil-faced, pseudonons. And outside of that, I have no constraints. So the simple idea for this one, so if people who've watched the other ones, obviously it's usually me talking to people who work here to try and figure out why they would work here in the first place, which we should do for you at some point. This is Josh, by the way. Josh works on what we call Urbit.org, but is kind of a vague definition, effectively like make Urbit
we're
useful
kind of making it up as we go.
Developers, is how I think about it. And someday we should cover your background, but what we were talking about, I don't know how this came, I don't remember where it came up, but somehow it came up that basically the history of how I ended up working on this thing is not anywhere, and that we could start there. But I actually don't know. I think I simply said someone could do that, and then you said I'll do it, and that's pretty much the entire preliminary amount of work.
And that's why we're here today.
Yeah, and that's about it. So anyway, I'm going to let Josh drive this time around, and I'm just going to try to keep my answers from being too long. And we're going to call it an hour.
Sounds good. Well, cool. Yeah, we'll get to know you a little bit. You've definitely got a lot of lore in your head, I'm sure, that will be interesting for all of us. But I do want to figure out who this mystery person is.
Yeah,
And
probably.
so
Yeah.
to kind of set the stage there, I guess before Urbit, what does your background look like briefly?
Yeah, I don't have a super brief answer to that question, but I can give you the shortest possible one, and then maybe you can decide what you think is the most interesting.
Sounds
I
good.
grew up around a lot of people who were interested in technology, I guess, is a vague way to put it, because I grew up kind of in the fringe of Silicon Valley in like Santa Cruz County. So lots of people who live in Santa Cruz who commute to, or at least at the time, it's like .com era, are commuting over the hill. So even like my high school friends were picking up tech work basically and making, like $600 or, like some insane, yeah, but obviously tiny amounts of money for doing other stuff. So it wasn't actually the money. It was just like, computers were around and fascinating. Um, but I wasn't that interested in um, programming and engineering per se. I think I was always interested in it as like a means to an end. I liked making stuff, and I was like, I don't care, I'll figure out how to make it, but I'm kind of more interested in like the thing itself, which has usually had more to do with like, I was just like designing, building websites of all different kinds, shapes, and sizes. Um, anyway, from California was like, I have to get as far away as possible from here, like literally like what is the furthest I can get from home, and that was like East Coast New York world, and I knew vaguely, yeah, like I love making stuff. What does that like? What could I possibly study to get better at making stuff? Which I think was pretty vague. Is as vague as I describe it. And long story short is, yeah, I ended up studying architecture, which I actually think is a pretty good satisfies that requirement. It's kind of like the history of people making stuff at relatively large scale. Um, and yeah, I was always interested in like making stuff to me, I guess, is like not just designing stuff. Maybe that's kind of, it's like there's stuff, it's like, yeah, you can just like draw something on paper and be like, I think I want it to be like this. But if you don't understand like how it's going to actually get made, it's a little bit unsatisfying, even just in terms of or like that's how I always felt. I was like, I want to like understand the totality of making it. Architecture school definitely satisfied that because yeah, you have to. So I went to like I have a B arc, which means you have to like study structures um, and do a fair amount of technical work. Honestly, probably could be more technical if I was going to redesign the architecture curriculum. Um, and while I was in school, I managed to go to school for free, which is amazing. But the kind of caveat on that is that you have to pay to live in New York. And so I paid to live in New York by doing like building websites and doing basically like random client work. Um, and so I just had this like long history of this mix of kind of like broad design thinking and then just like really practical day to day, effectively just like engineering work. So by the time I was done with school, and school very much biased me towards thinking about large scale human systems, and I had all this experience working in like the traditional web stack, I was like, the traditional web stack, like this is fucking bullshit. Like this is not going to work in terms of like what it's actually doing for people. Anyway, then there's like,
Yeah,
ellipsis, like long, whatever,
yeah,
happy to cover the details. And then I basically just discover Urbit on the internet. And I'm like, okay, this might work.
yeah, yeah. So before I get into that, just I remember one of the very first conversations you and I had at this kind of meetup, I think back in 2016 in the janky old office, was about Christopher Alexander,
Hmm.
um, who took me down the whole rabbit hole. But I'm curious to know how that influence has affected you and this project.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a very academic answer to that, which is that um, I, let's see, has this actually, so the, trying to think of like the dumbest answer, like where did I start reading Christopher Alexander? Um, in the last year of school at Cooper, where I went, that it's a thesis year, and so you do like an independent project. Um, and I was really interested the, in some ways, kind of like I was interested in the tools that architects use to draw and think, and both from a historical, like a sort of long-term historical perspective. So you can think about drawing, like drawing is really like an invention, right? We invented this ability to draw, and then perspective, the ability to render the real world, and the feedback loop there, right, where I can draw something and then I can build it, and it can be relatively close to the drawing. That's like amazing technology. It's really like incredible technology. You can go from something that you imagine, and then you have this dialectic between what you imagine and what's on the paper, and then between what's on paper and what gets built. We could talk about the thesis work for a long time. You get the idea. There's this thread of like, I mean, it was like starting with like, you know, how does map making, like how people built Gothic churches, which is like early construction drawings is absolutely amazing, because it's like, you don't have any of this excessive bullshit that we have today about like, how do I get a rendering to look amazing so someone gives me a lot of money? It's like, I'm just trying to get this thing done and get it built. So if you look, for example, like the difference between like a Gothic cathedral and the drawings that were made for it, the drawings are these like perfect abstractions. Like they're just these beautiful grids, because all they were trying to do is understand like, how do I figure out how to precisely lay things out? So all the sort of Baroque parts of what we look at in like ancient architecture are like not what the architect, like the actual architect as master builder was thinking about. Anyway, so that's kind of the seed of it, right? That's fascinating. So then like, how do architects think about what their technology is? It's a long thread of research there. Leibniz, Boole, you know, kind of like history of computing. How do we think about computing as this formalization of, you know, of thought? So Christopher Alexander's thesis is called Notes on the Synthesis of Form, which is pretty much about this, like, because he's interested in how do architects go about figuring out, you know, what's the difference between when I'm an architect and I say a building should look like this, how can I justify that fact? How do I say, yes, this is the correct building, because why? You know, what is the synthesis of the context and all of the things that I think, and how can I tell the difference between what I think and, you know, my particular proposal and someone else's proposal? And I went to, like, there's maybe a whole other hour-long conversation about like the kind of difference in academic tradition between the world of Cooper, which especially when I was there is still in the lineage of the kind of like, what are, I think of like the New York Five, or like kind of late modern, like Haydock, Eisenman, Raymond Abraham, Leibniz Woods.
Postmodern kind of architecture.
Yeah, well, it's complicated. Some of them are better than others, I'd say. Cooper is like a very Beaux-Arts, like traditional and traditionally conceived of, like arc of education. But then, yeah, all the voices there are these sort of, are kind of formalist. They're like into making what they think of as beautiful stuff. It's all about form, I guess, the way I think about it. But there's a famous argument between Eisenman and Alexander. Like Alexander is like the diametric opposite of like the architectural tradition that I came out of. But I sort of arrived at like the same kind of skepticism of like of the discipline that Christopher Alexander did. So I sort of discovered it at the end of my architecture career, and then, yeah, that was like a deep and and menacing rabbit hole that everyone should go down.
Yeah.
So yeah, Alexander, right, is much more about, it's basically like, look, stop thinking about it from the standpoint of like, you are an author, you're trying to make something and produce some vision of the future. You should think about it in terms of how people live. What's it like what does it feel like to be inside a place, and what's the difference between what it feels like and how you conceived of it? And actually, yeah, a lot of the I think architectural discourse is just super formalist. It's more about just how do I design this thing
as an end in and of itself.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's just very like I don't know. I don't know how deep you want. Architecture is, the summary of my feeling about architecture is that architecture has become basically just like it's a totally vocational, it's been dominated by the industry of building buildings, and it doesn't really have that much to do with what architecture in the ancient sense is about, which is like about thinking about how people are going to live and come together and build systems. And I think Christopher Alexander is like one of the last architects who still thinks in that way. But I would argue that Haydock, who's the founder of the sort of current Cooper tradition, also was. So that's why it's kind of complicated. Some of those people I'm not so into. But yeah, so but Christopher Alexander was also trained as a mathematician. So he has also this kind of like, I was an outlier in school because I'm someone who was like way more technical than most of my peers whom I like and get along with, but it's like a different thing. And Alexander also, I think, was able to think about things like analytically in a way that's really great. So he has this balance of like super empathetic way of thinking and very analytical. And so I guess that's the beginning of that rabbit hole. And then if you keep going down, and he was concerned with, and it was obviously like Design Patterns, the famous engineering book, is like was heavily influenced by a pattern language, and he knew that and was conscious of that, and like overlapped with the software community to some degree. And so yeah, I think that maybe like my postgraduate education was definitely dominated by reading a lot of Christopher Alexander, or that's like definitely one of the biggest influences after school, which was kind of a more formalist training. I don't know if that's the real. I mean, we can get more into why I think Christopher Alexander is important, but people should just read Christopher Alexander. It's like he's such a significant
I agree.
intellectual figure.
Yeah.
I mean, I also find it, you might say like I'm like Christopher Alexander to me is like I started reading Christopher Alexander and you're like, oh, okay, this is someone who's like in school. I'm like, okay, maybe there's new intellectual territory that's like not yet figured out. Like I'm like, these people don't know what the fuck they're doing. Like there's something missing from like there's this great tragedy of like architecture as a discipline should produce people who can think about like how should we come together, how should we live. But it's not doing that. Why is that? Is there something wrong with this intellectual tradition? And then you're like, oh, well, actually, this guy kind of gets it. And he's done the intellectual work. And I think that maybe in a way like bent me back towards like, all right, look, the intellectual work here is actually done. And that's like, we don't need to worry about that as much. You need to go and make it happen. And that's why then there's like, I guess, if you're too lazy to go and read, there's a lot of Christopher Alexander writing. It's quite easy to read. That Oopsla talk.
It's great.
It's great, but like if
it's fascinating, yeah.
the
and
TLDR, I think that Oopsla talk is the one that just like makes that bridge, right? Where it's like, I think he sets it up really clearly of just like, look, the task is actually on how computing affects our lives. Like there's an open territory there that where a lot of these questions about how people can be organized in I don't know the right in new ways in new ways that are also in a way maybe more ancient. Like there's a huge possibility you could do that with software basically. Anyway, I'm not going to try and I haven't watched the talk in a while, but it's not worth summarizing. Just go watch it.
Well, I think there's definitely some interesting parallels there to the where modern architecture went and Christopher Alexander's take on kind of where it went wrong and what you're doing here with Urbit and kind of some of the motivating forces behind how we think about software, which I think we can explore throughout the next 45 minutes. But before that, like, okay, so jumping back to you, what led you to this project? You found it on the internet. Okay, and then what? Urbit.
Yeah, so let's see. So I like retelling this story over and over because I just like, maybe I just don't want to forget it and I also think it's funny. So backing up a little bit, I ended up living in New York for a while before I went back to school. And during that time I worked in kind of like I worked for agencies and with friends and just did a lot of kind of like ad hoc, interactive work, whatever. That's like, this is pre-startups just dominating everything, right? And by the end of that, it was like, all your work just comes from friends. And so at some point, I think, I'm actually pretty sure it was in 2008, I got approached by a couple of friends who were, I'd like work for sort of like, sometimes for big companies, for like record labels or artists or whatever, just making stuff. And I got approached by a few friends who were working on like, I actually don't remember exactly what they wanted to build, but I knew they were working for this magazine ... which is like a like whatever journal of thoughtful stuff that I think is still around. Anyway, they were like, they had some idea for a big project, and it's like a cool project. And I remember I like out of nowhere, I was like, I don't think there's any point in building any other websites until we can basically build an operating system that is like native to the internet. Like this is just pointless. I can't do this anymore. And it was like within this one conversation, I was just like, it's not going to happen. And that was, but I was still in school and I knew I wasn't about to go. And I knew two things. I knew A, I wasn't going to go and do this project by myself, and I had other things lined up for like the next couple of years or whatever, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, I knew that, like, I just knew that that was true. I was like, there's just no way you're going to take this like pastiche of stuff. And so I was just on the lookout, I think, you know, I was like, anything that can start to solve this problem more holistically, like I want to know about. And actually I definitely tried and was kind of like toying with different ways that you could build systems for people to, that, you know, that people could either run themselves or that people could take more like complete control over or whatever, like for effectively, you know, publishing, communicating, whatever it might be. Certainly spent plenty of like summers experimenting with stuff, but I felt like, I mean, I think I was just like, there's got to be a solution to this problem. I'm not sure what it is. And yeah, I had other things going on. So by the time I graduated from school, and you know, this was like a more imminent, I was like, all right, I don't want to have to go and like work for a big company. I mean, that wasn't even on the table, honestly. I was like, there's no way I'm going to do that. That's fucking stupid. I don't care about that. And
Yeah.
and to be clear, it's not like I had some. I think I was just so used to being broke, you know, like when you live as like an art student for that long, basically, it's like whatever, you know, it's fine.
Mm-hmm.
I was happy to just be able
Yeah.
to like be outside. And I mean, I think that's like I'm trying to think of like, I would just look at every possible thing that was any
Mm-hmm.
form of, you know, could get people their computing back, you know? I remember I spent a lot of
Yeah.
time playing with and building a few things on top of Camla Store, which was like Brad Fitz's project from a while ago. So I was like, you know, there's something to, and I still think there's totally something to like, just, I was like, all right, you want someone to be able to kind of back up their life stream of stuff, you know, where does that go? And Camel Store is still a good project, and I think the Go community is interesting and thoughtful, but it doesn't, it's very single player, basically.
I see.
And I think that's like, after playing with those things deeply, I felt like, it's missing something. And probably in the midst of that, yeah, it was when I mean, I literally found Urbit on Hacker News. I think I was like the, you know, 40th or 30th or whatever in some archive somewhere. There's like, you could figure out like, I'm just like one of the first people to get on the network. So there were like Urbit docs in those days that like, effectively, I'm pretty sure just like leaked. I think they were fundraising at the time or something. And so yeah, so I hopped on the network, and the fact that you could boot, it was still really easy. I mean, and obviously I'm like was relatively technical, but just to boot it was super easy. It
What
took
year
me a
was this?
second. This is 2013.
Or when was it? 2013. Okay.
But there is a gap there, right? It's like I graduated from school in, I think, 2011, and was working on other stuff, and I was like, yeah, I spent a couple of years just like looking for other things. Wait, I'm admitting, and I worked on a project with a friend, a good friend, old friend. It was actually it was sort of like, in a way, it was actually not that different. It's sort of similar to Landscape with no Urbit, and we had gotten that relatively far along, and there were good, you know, thousands of people using it, and I was like, I don't really see how this plays out. You know, I was like, I'm like, I don't know, like, what do you do with
Yeah.
like you're gonna. It was more, this was in the world of like everything was in, you know, had a better API. And so we would sort of aggregate all of your data into a single unified interface and let you build sort of spaces that you shared with other people. It was cool. But yeah, I didn't know. I knew there was something missing from it. And we sort of started to whine. We knew, I think we were both like, you know, this has been fun, but
It's not going to
work.
Yeah.
It's like not a company, and it's not self-sustaining. Yeah. And then probably 6 months later, like it was like relatively soon after that I found Urbit and booted it.
Okay, so you found Urbit, you booted it, and then you end up as CEO.
Yeah.
What happens in there?
Right. Well, I'm not the CEO of Urbit, as you obviously know, but like
Not that, but you know,
I mean, for anyone, I don't know whatever, for those in 10 years from now watching this or whatever, right? It's like, even then, there's Urbit, which already had a number of people who own pieces of it, and then there's Tlon, the company trying to make Urbit a thing. So, um, for some other funny pieces of history, I booted Urbit, then actually like 2 weeks later, or something, I don't know, not that long. I mean, the cool thing is I booted Urbit, and then I was able to just talk to people on the network, and you could talk to all these people who were working on it and just ask them questions about it. And I think I was like, wait, for some reason, I remember getting on an email thread, which it would be fun to dig up somewhere, where I was, yeah, just talking to, I think I just ended up like emailing with Curtis, like within a couple of hours, right? And so the fact that, I think it's also just, I mean, it's the same thing that people experience now. It's like these people were very open and easy to connect with, and like, smart and motivated, and it was just like you were able to drop into like asking questions about what the hell this thing was and how it was working and so on in a way that was like pretty smooth and easy. So that went on for a little while. Then I remember there was a talk. It was like the first Urbit talk ever. That was probably, I think I've at some point figured this out. Anyway, it's in like late summer, early fall of 2013. So I went to this talk, and the best thing about this talk is that you had all these other decentralized web people there. And I like, obviously want the decentralized web to exist. Like I'm there because I want the decentralized web to exist. But everybody got up and they gave these talks that were like, here's my little, blogging platform that of course still runs on a server somewhere that someone has to configure. Here's my home server project that like you have to build from scratch. And like the stuff is cool, but every single one of them like obviously is like going to be, I'm just like, God,
kind of missing the point.
like, well, it's just not going to work. Like, I'm like, guys, we want everyone to use this. Okay, come on. And everyone there is smart and, funded by Mozilla or whatever. Like, they're like, this is, and then Curtis, like, they didn't have enough time. It was like they were running out of time. Maybe they're supposed to be really short talks. And I remember Curtis got up and he was just like, the whole stack is hosed. You need to throw it away. Everything but Unix and the internet needs to be replaced. You need to replace it with something that's simple enough for an ordinary person to use. And if you can't do that, all bets are off. The project's called Urbit. You can check it out. And I was like, this guy actually knows what he's talking about. I mean, it was like he was like saying what no one was willing to admit, like technically, which is like, yeah, this whole thing is built for some other purpose. It's industrial grade software. Just fucking forget it. Come on, you're not even talking about like what computing is about. And I was like, yeah, you're right. Like, and you've done the work, So obviously at this point, it's like, I know that there's like 10 years of personal work gone into this thing, and I've dived into it enough to know that it's technically serious. So you can't make that claim on its own. But if you're like, I have this thing that actually works as a prototype, okay, like now we can talk, right?
Yeah, now we're talking.
Yeah. So I guess in some ways I just was like, that's all luck and hacker use. Whatever. There's nothing special.
You saw it, you were there.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I had other projects going on like that I was still kind of doing for money. And, but I was like, all right, I want to work on this thing. I had just got married and we were going on a trip. So I remember I went on the trip and took all like a bunch of Urbit documentation and just like was like, all right, I'm going to spend time learning about this thing while I just go surfing and go to the islands. Did that, came back and was like, all right, I'm going to transition into working on this thing full time. And that didn't happen until March or something. It took a long time. So I started doing a little bit of stuff and yeah, I also knew it was pretty clear just how well, yeah, there's like pretty significant amount of technical work in. I mean, looking back, it's funny, like looking back, I'm like, wow, there were so many things that were totally fucked. But it was like, well, I was just like, we're just going to work through them one by one or something, So the company itself is not super organized. That's relatively, well, maybe it's not obvious, but like any company at the beginning is never like doesn't know what it's doing.
Yeah, it's not surprising.
Yeah. And especially when I just can't I think it'd be funny. It's too bad we don't have these like throughout the years because like at the time I was naive enough to think oh, you can just build, we were talking about this the other day, like you can just like build new technology and sort of product and like turn it into a product and distribute it all at once. Like that's just, that's normal, right? But I had no experience doing this
Hmm.
kind of stuff. And
Yeah,
yeah, that's just not really a thing that people do for good
it's not
reason,
how it works. Yep.
because maturing system software is fucking crazy and hard,
Hmm.
as I now know.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
and I didn't know any. I was just, yeah, I was the right amount of naive. I think actually, um,
It's what you need. Otherwise,
probably
no one would do
true.
it. Yeah.
I think, or people would do it in this really like professionalized way. But yeah. Anyway, so I knew that there were things at the company that needed to be fixed and figured out, and I knew that there were and I knew we just needed to make, I mean, for me, the point obviously was just like make this thing something that people can actually use. I mean, that was why I wanted to work on something like this. And I found something that was technically serious enough that you could use it as a foundation. Um, uh, so let's see. I mean, the question was like, how do I end up as CEO? I mean, the short answer to that is that we worked out the problems with the company by me taking over as CEO, which takes another, uh, year, I think. I think I took over in 2015.
Yeah.
And yeah,
From what I understand, there's an interesting story there that
yeah,
I don't really know in full. So I'd be curious to hear like what
yeah.
the heck happened here.
So I think that calling Urbit basically like this an independent PhD project is basically correct for a couple of reasons. Meaning, um, it was worked on for a very long time in a very passive way, which is a perfect way to work on research, right? Just go surf, go ride your bike, and then work for like an
Hmm.
hour with, let the good ideas
Yeah.
come to you and then just make them happen.
Hammock-driven development.
Exactly. And that was like what was going on for a long time. Um, I think the funny thing about this is that it's something that does bother me because people are like, oh, Urbit's been around forever. I'm like, yeah, that's a good thing because it means it was maturing at the right rate when it needed to mature at the right rate. And it's also like, it's not, we've only been operating as we haven't been operating as, it's not like it's been however, you know, 20 years, it's an insanely long time, 18 years or something with like 20 people. I mean, that
Yeah.
would be crazy. And we'd be
Yeah.
a lot further along. Um, uh, anyway, my point is that, so I think
Maybe.
Curtis had the technical vision, and the right sort of like existing, uh, you know, like prototype grade foundation, and decided to work with John to basically get this off the ground as a company. Um, as I think he has stated publicly, and I don't think he'd be embarrassed by this, in large part because he was basically broke, because he worked in the late 90s on basically writing the kernel to a mobile web browser that was shipped like, I'm not going to remember his joke about this, but it's like, it shipped like a billion units and like 10,000 of them were ever used or something like that. Like it
Yeah.
was like the first mobile web browser, but no one actually used it. But I think it was a
For
relatively
anyone.
serious,
Yeah.
good technical project, but also made him the money that he could go do this PhD project. And then when the money ran out, he was like, well, let's try and turn this project into a company. Also not the
Yeah.
best reason to start a company. But it's fine.
Well, here we are.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it worked. Obviously
Yeah.
worked out. Uh, and I mean, the short answer is just like, yeah, I think chose the wrong co-founder for reasons that are totally unclear to me and probably unclear to him in retrospect. And we managed to work it out by just being like, look, man, you gotta go. And that's never a friendly conversation. There's no way to
Mm-mm.
make that very easy. We did the best that we could, and it obviously worked out okay. Um, our investors were happy, and I can't say that, but well, I will say this. So the thing about that was a great initiation for me is that it taught me a lot about just like operations, basically, because I
Mm-hmm.
had to take over and basically get that done, and just move things forward and get this thing to actually work because I really really wanted it to work. Uh, it's actually kind of like a good thing in a way. It's like that often happens, I think, in relationships in general. It's like when the relationship is really tested, you're like, okay, well, actually, I do want this to work out. Um, so
Yeah.
I think it was something like that. It was like, this is I was like, holy shit, this is a disaster. And then you're like, well, I think I actually want to fix this disaster because I care about this thing a lot and I want it to work.
Yeah, yeah, it's
Um,
worth it.
yeah. So it was worth it. And yeah, we eventually, it was definitely like a contentious and ugly thing for a little while, but we worked it out. And then I think it was a weird transition. Like they had raised money in September or whatever, the end of, it was really, I think the whole thing was closed by like early 2014. And then by 2015, it was like, okay, we're going to need to figure out. Like I was taking over a company that was seed funded, not very much, for like whatever, 5 people, and has now an even shorter, or not. I mean, it has a shorter runway just by the nature of the fact that we wasted all this time with this ridiculous conflict up front, which makes it all the more educational. Ultimately, is like really, it was like, okay, this is like super challenging. Not only do you have like a research project you're trying to turn into a company, but like you're not exactly teed up to, it's not going to be easy.
Yeah, yeah, and you've got all these, personal these personnel stripe issues, which are hard even when you don't have a research project that you're doing with,
Yeah, somewhere
in
in
this
there, I
way.
think
Like
was
it's
like, so like, I'm not a mold bug fan, right? I never really, I mean, at some point in there, I'm sure I figured out my gloss on, I think my introduction to mold bug was like something like where I'm like, discovered this thing. I'm like, I can't read, like someone edit this down to something I can actually read. Like, I'm not going to read this. I don't care about this.
yeah,
And obviously knew Curtis personally and liked working with him. But somewhere during that time is when then also Urbit becomes this like insanely controversial thing, which came, so it was, I don't know, maybe I
hmm
just like, I was like, you know what? Fuck all of you. We're going to make this work. uh,
yeah. I
uh,
don't care. We have bigger problems.
I
Yeah,
think it just boils down to like, I'm like, this thing is good. Like, we're going to make it work. Like, and
yeah.
um, so yeah, that was definitely motivating. Um, and then I think I took over in 2015, and then I was sort of like, all right, we can forget about. We did have some of our seed investors basically kind of re-up very slightly to like extend our runway, which is great, and I helped get that done. And I was like, all right, the way that this is really going to work is to make this into a community. This has to be moved forward by the community. And so that was, I think, really from 2015 to 2016 was like, we have to get to the point that we can do a sale of address space. So by 2016, we did that, which was also, these are, I mean, it's funny, the context here was like, oh, well, like capture some of the Tlon lore. And I'm like, some of the stuff was so insane. It is mildly embarrassing to talk about, like, I'm just like, I don't know if you want all the details, man. Uh, uh,
Well, it's good because we're still here. So
yeah, yeah,
the
yeah,
embarrassment, it got resolved.
yeah, yeah, that's
You
true.
know,
Uh,
yeah.
I think that at that point, it was like a very do or die thing. You're like, okay, look, no one's ever going to, this is fucking, I like at this point, I'm like, oh yeah, guess what? No one actually, a startup building completely new technology. Yeah, maybe if you're like Elon or or you're doing some insane hard, like a software startup that's going to be really capital intensive. Fucking kidding me? Like, that's ridiculous.
Isn't that like that's the whole point of a software startup? It's not capital intensive.
Exactly. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know.
No, people are just like, this is crazy. I don't know. Good luck.
Yeah.
So I'm like, all right, it's pretty do or die. Let's just like, we will, you know, get down. Like, let's not worry about like having a ton of runway. Basically, like we're just gonna go down to the wire, and and you kind of like we'll do a crowd sale when we're basically gonna die. Um, and so by the time that we like just do the best work we possibly can, I mean, this isn't like, we obviously like want to like, do the most you can with the capital that you have, and just don't try and, no hype, no what, there's no other thing, just make it good. Um, and so by the time that we ran that crowd sale in 2016, I just remember that like Curtis couldn't watch. He like literally had to leave the office when we announced it, because I'm pretty sure he was like, we're dead. Like, this is it. It's over. And to be honest, I didn't know either, like what was going to
Yeah.
happen. Um,
Yeah.
and we had like a week beforehand somehow like we figured out that like the way we were going to run the sale like wasn't going to work. Like we weren't going to be able to actually run it using the platform that we were using. And so we had to have like a last ditch effort to like just send a personal email to a different payment processor to like try and get them to source, and they did. And you know, it's like everything is coming together like down to the wire at the last minute kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, yeah, then we sold that sale out in, you know, like 2 hours or something like that, like an hour and a half, which at the time was like not, it's like a star is $250. Sold 1,000 of them, I think. So, but raising, that was like insane, you know, raising 250K from the public when at the
Yeah.
time, like everyone is supposed to hate us and this is completely impossible and undoable project. Uh,
Yeah.
I don't think I felt any degree of relief, but I was definitely exciting. I think things start
Yeah.
to, anyway,
Okay.
that's where things start to like turn around.
Yeah. Because there was another crowd sale then too. I think that's the one I got in on.
Exactly, yeah. So there was a year, like once we did that, we were like, okay, we can probably do this again, and we should think about doing it in a much larger way. And, you
Hmm.
know, the Ethereum sale had happened at that point, and so this was like becoming more of a thing. Um, and so we had planned to do another public one, and what we were going to do, I mean, we observed a couple of things. It's funny to think about that, like, I'm going to forget a lot of the context. By that time, there are beginning to be some of these like just, you know, overly hyped, like basically vacuous projects like that aren't really about doing anything. You know, obviously Ethereum is very real, but there are plenty of other projects that were totally ridiculous um, that were consuming a lot of capital, which we felt actually was, I don't think we were like, oh, hey, it's going to be easy to raise money in crypto or something like that. We were like, maybe it's not a good thing. I remember some prospective investor being like, this is later, but more or less reflects the same sentiment, coming into the office and there are people actually doing work. And he was like, you know, it's a real red flag that anyone's doing work in here. And
Wow.
yeah, like,
Wow.
but
That's
we felt like, okay,
remarkable.
look, the risk is actually, and you saw this happen a lot, where like these sales would sell out in, you know, like Augur and these like similar sales would
Yeah.
sell out in like 15 minutes and they'd be bought out by like one person. And we really didn't want that to happen. Like we really wanted that we were, and still are to some degree, you know, like relative purists about this whole thing. Like we want people to actually, we want the address space to be owned by people who are going to put it to work and use it and do things with it.
Hmm.
And so we thought a lot about just like how you can get a really, really good distribution. And so and we thought one of the problems with these big sales, these big public sales, is that you just have these like anonymous investors who can come in and own huge portions of the network. And then they're probably going to go and basically liquidate it somehow. And through that liquidation, who knows who ends up with this? And half these people lose their keys and
Hmm.
no one cares. And it's a net negative for the network. So we
Yeah.
thought, okay, well, it actually the just selling to your mailing list, right, which is how we did that first. So just like send an email. We knew our mailing list is mostly like developers, people who follow us. That's pretty good for distribution. Like those people care
Hmm.
about this project. Let's just try and give it directly to them. Um, so we decided to, yeah, try and basically every time we do this, you just try and show some degree of progress. Again, yeah, being way too earnest about it in some ways, but we felt like, look, these people believe in us. We want to show them that we're serious and that we're going somewhere with this. I don't remember. It'd be interesting to like, I mean, I think by 2017, it's like, you know, there were more and more like interface experiments. Like Urbit was useful and we were showing off. I think the first time around we had like a repository of different like demo apps and examples. And we had like
Hmm.
one version of the interface. And then by the next time around, the interface had gotten, we had probably, you know, redone it completely. And at that time, I mean, the first couple of, at this time, but like in the beginning, I'm like the only JavaScript engineer at Urbit. So all those first interfaces I basically built, like designed and built myself, probably designed and built the website too. Um, you know,
Hmm.
I mean,
Hmm.
we're just like, it's like me, Curtis, and Phil for a lot of that time. Anton, Henry, who now works on Eco. Uh, Anton is still around. I mean, Anton's still on the network for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. He's always in the PRs.
Good, yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, and a few rotating people. And then I think Ted joined in 2016 2017.
I think it's 2017. Yeah.
Yeah, late 2017. So after that next sale.
Hmm.
And that was like, yeah, by late 2017, there's like momentum picking up um, uh, in crypto in general, and like the Filecoin sale was happening. Um, and I think we were still just like deeply skeptical of the public sale. Like it just seemed like for the kind of thing that Urbit is as an asset, it's just not meant to be traded. Like it's not a trading
Hmm.
asset. It's not a currency. Like, and so if you treat it as such and only sell to people who are going to treat it that way, uh, that's problematic in terms of like it actually being operated and being used. So then,
Yeah.
yeah, we sold a chunk of address space just privately, where it was like I could actually, and part of the vetting process was like, you need to talk to me. I need to know that
Yeah.
you're a real human, and you need to
Yeah.
understand what this is. Uh,
Mm.
and that's then by late 28 or not late, like early 2018, I feel like that's when like Tlon becomes what it is, more or
Yeah.
less now. Um,
Hmm. That's when
anyway, that's a
you know,
longer.
basically, yeah.
I will
Yeah.
say that's, but then by
Okay.
20, so then, and then Curtis took off, I think in whatever, early 2019 or something like that. So then I felt like the coup is complete or whatever. Like, I mean, it's a friendly,
You've taken it
totally,
over. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, it's like just getting
Yeah.
back to your original question, right? Very friendly parting of ways. This is like Curtis put in enormously important sort of foundational work, but has like been taken over by other people, which was the point anyway. Um, and I think we'd also, yeah, my original interest in this thing was to make it useful, and I think it was pretty clear that we were like on track to that towards that end. Most of Tlon is aimed at that, and
Hmm.
doing that forces Urbit itself to be more mature and more understandable and more robust. Um, and that problem is a kind of like sort of system software engineering problem that I wouldn't say is like well known or well understood in Silicon Valley as it exists today, but is very different from doing like an independent PhD project basically.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so
Tell
yeah,
me a little about, I know a bit about this from, being part of it now, but about the culture of Tlon,
yeah,
and what that has been like over time. Has
yeah.
it changed much? And how would you even describe it?
That's a good question. I was talking to someone who uh, uh, I met apparently in 2017. I felt like it was earlier. Um, uh, Hannes, who's a Swiss journalist, who's great, and he came and hung out with us in San Francisco in our old um, uh, the office with the fig tree that you probably remember.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, man, there's so many. The offices themselves are like a funny story. I wish we had more photos of this. They're just so
Oh yeah, that
shitty.
office was great. I remember the bucket in the corner catching the, leaking water from the roof or something. That was,
That was fun. There was a definite. Oh,
I
and
think it was in the kitchen.
yeah, yeah, the kitchen and that fig tree was amazing though. Like it had a
Mm.
super productive fig tree that you would get. I would trade figs. It was right by Four Barrel, so I would trade figs to people at Four Barrel for coffee. Not like we couldn't afford it. It wasn't that bad, but like just because the figs were amazing, it was a good trade. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, the one before that was even weirder, honestly. Um, anyway, let's see. So uh, I've totally lost. I
So
like
culture of
completely don't know.
Tlon,
Yeah, what's the
figs,
culture of Tlon? Yeah,
figs,
culture of
figs
Tlon
apart. Yeah.
is about figs. So anyway, yeah, I was talking to Hannes. So I was talking to Hannes, and he had come and he'd seen that office and that period of the company, and we were talking about how I do think, like Curtis and I are totally different, like in so many ways, uh, but we get along well and loved working together, and I almost feel like that's like the seed of the culture of Tlon is like people who are totally different from each other who want to work on something together and can do that like very productively in large part because they are very different from one another. And because like the question is like, how do you make something that we can both agree on, right? Like that's kind of Urbit is meant to be neutral infrastructure. And there's always people that's like, you can't, neutrality is impossible. I'm like, well, I don't know about that. Like, I think there are lots
Hmm.
of systems in the world that are, I'd say neutrality is really hard. It's deceptively difficult. It's like, you
Hmm.
got to take it really seriously. You have to be willing to ask and answer any question. You can't be like, you have to think from first principles and be fearless about it.
Yeah.
And I think I come from a background of, there's famous story of like in an architecture critique at Cooper, professor literally like lighting drawings on fire on the wall because they sucked. And like,
Wow.
uh,
That's a great image.
yeah. So I think it's
Yeah.
actually just
Like,
putting a cigarette out on a drawing. Um,
okay. It wasn't like,
famous
taking a
Cooper
torch
lore.
to it and, okay.
That would have
All
been
right.
even better. Yeah, just burn the whole
You're
building
like, this
down.
is shit.
This sucks.
Yeah.
Uh, but I think that there's also this, part of like thinking from first principles is, and kind of being fearless about it, is that it's fraught with conflict. That it's going to be, it's going to be hard, and you're going to do things more than once, and there's, coming like finding neutrality is like not easy. It's not easy.
Hmm.
It's hard because you're like looking for something that neither one of you that you don't necessarily, you have to like figure out where all of your disagreements are or something like that.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so
And it's
I
very
think,
uncomfortable. So you have to be like,
yeah,
willing to be in that space for a
yes.
while,
So
you
one of
know?
the things that was definitely like we had to learn. So I think that's where one of the interesting things about growing the company. So part of the DNA of the company is that, yeah, Curtis and I would just ruthlessly yell at each other. I mean, like literally just have like screaming fights at each other with each other. I mean, it's not that bad, but like that, and it was super intense, but super productive because we're both ruthless
Hmm.
and but also want to work. Like want to figure out like
Yeah.
whatever how the thing is going to work. Um, and then so then when the company got a little bigger, that was definitely something we had to figure out. Like get out of the
Yeah. Like,
office
how do we
because you're like
scream at each other in front of people?
it was
Yeah.
definitely like
And not
not,
freak
and for
them
like
out.
people who just, yeah, like
Yeah.
who just joined and like don't
Have
understand the
come from like
dynamic.
any other company.
Yeah.
Yeah.
uh, yeah. Super productive, honestly. And it's an important thing to be, you got to be able to like, get into it and not be precious about it. Um, so anyway, I think the seeds of the culture of the company come mostly from that, of just this kind of like, look, you need to be willing to start, you need to be able to understand something such that you can start from first principles and understand how it got from there to what you're trying to, accomplish or what you're building. And you need to not be uncomfortable being asked any question about why it is a certain way or whatever it is. And I think that's like something we try and also show off in terms of how we talk about Urbit publicly and how we field questions from the public and interact with people. It's like, what do you want to know? Um, I think that when you get a lot of people to work together, um, you can't let that process become chaotic. And so I suppose like the culture has changed in some ways by trying to, I guess, add in some other element of just like process, and trying to be relative and just like discipline, which I actually think, um, I don't know if that's actually new. I'd say the thing that Curtis and I were capable of like, have like fighting very intensely, but we both work like insanely hard and like love to work and will like working on, we're
Hmm.
just like, we're the first people there in the morning, the last people to leave, or, we're there so far before everybody else that it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's
You
not
start your
out
day at
of,
like 5 a.m. or something.
yeah, I mean, yeah, it's great. I would highly recommend it in general. That's actually somewhat recent.
Mm.
Uh, but I just like to work. Like I like making stuff. It's fun. The stuff is fun. Like it's
Hmm.
really fun and really satisfying.
It is fun.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think there's maybe the sort of original DNA there is basically like, if you're going to make something really good, you have to work on it really hard. You may have to do it more than once. You're going to have to like, it just takes literal man hours of work. And so to get that to scale up, you have to create processes where, yeah, we have enough lead time on whatever it might be so that people can do it more than once. And so that there's enough time to look at it again and to talk about it and to throw it away and to start over or whatever. So I think that, scaling up that stuff is all about formalizing those things. And some of that becomes just literal process, like how we write OKRs and how we talk about them and how we run meetings and stuff. And some of it is just, immaterial, how people relate to each other.
Yeah, the way people interact. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think how has it changed? I mean, no one screams at each other. Not really. I could probably handle more of it, but I don't want to.
It's harder to scream at each other when you don't have an office. That is
Yeah.
the quality of disagreements is very degraded online.
It's still super spirited. I mean, there's definitely we used to when the office was a thing. The level of intensity of debate on the team is I think is good, and sometimes actually is too. Is like it's almost like these things balance each other out, right? It's like you want to ask really hard questions and think deeply, but you also want to work really hard. You spend all your time talking shit, you're just gonna you're just gonna be stuck in a rabbit hole.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. Just go you have to do the work. And so I think you want to be able to show show something, put something on the wall. That's like
words and actions. You need a balance between those.
Yeah, I'm definitely more. I mean, it's interesting because it's like I'm more of a. I find this definitely still like pitching Urbit and trying to explain Urbit to people. I'm like, you want to understand what we're doing, you got to just use it. I mean, I think that's what's magical about Urbit itself, and what I found magical about it. Run from source is basically you want to understand this, just go understand it. Don't be lazy. Just go look at it. Read the fucking manual. And I think that's really important because I think that you can also the problem with talking about anything is that it just loses the referent. Literally what is the concrete referent that we're trying to talk about. And so I think culturally I try and make sure that you have a good balance of those things. Make sure we're looking at something that is made, not something talking only about what you can talk about what you might do only so much. Then you got to go and do it and then look at it. Yeah.
That's good. Okay, so we don't have a ton more time, but I do have a good question to wrap up on, which we can keep going.
Okay, cool. I think an hour. We can keep going a little bit. An hour is always a good. I just try and call it because it's you end up in that weird situation. A conversation is definitely going on too long, but no one wants to just turn it off.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. All right. Well, we'll try and get it not to that point, but there's something I think that's important that you can elaborate on a bit, which is, something that stuck with me for about a year now. I remember I had a conversation with you over DM back when I was, really just getting back into the project for, the fourth time. And I was reading through the documentation, and I think I was commenting to you something to the effect that, this documentation feels totally different than any other technical documentation I've read. It's pleasant to read. It's actually very interesting. It's not just to the point. And you said that what I was picking up on was the spiritual difference between Urbit and the rest of software.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? Can you elaborate on this spiritual difference?
Yeah. So, I mean, we've talked about this a lot. So, I'll try not to kind of give up or skip the context or something. This was also something I was very naive about at the beginning because I was someone who basically used existing software. So earlier we were talking about how most startups don't build technology. They repurpose existing technology to solve a problem. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. There are lots of cool things you can do with existing technology, but there are some things you can't do with existing technology. And one of those things I would argue is, basically build personal computing tools. And I think that, someone who's more of a, rationalist or something than I am will be able to come up with the intellectual framework for this difference. I've actually thought about this a lot, but I don't have a really clear difference. But if you look at the difference just in how like actual personal computing devices are made and how basically industrial grade software is made, meaning software that serves a lot of people one thing and it's not modifiable by the people that use it. This is where I'm like, I don't know, this is like a category that needs really good definition. I don't have the best definition for it, but let's just use that one. I do think those things are very differently made. They're just totally different. Even today, like even your laptop, okay, erase your web browser from it. It's a very different thing, has different qualities. You can actually still write, you can write software for it. You can do whatever you want with it. There's no point in, people complain about Apple like locking down their, ecosystem, blah, blah. Yeah, sure, that's true. I wish it was more open, but you can still do a lot even with like an off-the-shelf MacBook, just in terms of actually modifying it, playing with it. Could you understand it? Probably not, but you can go back and look at, like we have an Apple II in the office just for fun, and that thing is amazing. Like it just does exactly what it says it's going to do. You can open it up and, you can, it's such a spiritually different thing than like a piece of SaaS software. But we talk about them like they're the same thing, and they're not the same. Like they're not even close to the same. They have almost nothing to do with each other. It's like deceptive that we think about them as being in the same category, or it's just confusing. So I think that's like, I think of Urbit as existing in this very different tradition, which is like, look, this is supposed to maximize value for you, okay? We don't even care if you use it all the time. It should just be meaningful and valuable to you. So it's this sort of like, you should pay, ideally someone would pay whatever, $1,000 a month to keep their Urbit, but they only use it once a month or something. You could make up weird metrics like that. Like I think you have totally different rationale for why is this thing valuable. That's much more like it's a tool for you, not that it's I don't know, make number go up for the software manufacturer in terms of like raw number of users or whatever engagement and so on. I think that, maybe getting back also to like your original question, it's like you also see this with, most like software engineers and like software engineering culture. Like what do most software engineers do? They work on industrial grade software. That's just what the discipline of software engineering is. That's what it's about. It's like, I wish there was a difference here, because I do think that like building software doesn't necessarily mean, building centralized software. And so there's just, and I think that the whole, like if you think of like what is it like to if I'm someone who has to, figure out why like a message queue is clogged in my SaaS app, just like my state of mind and the kind of efficiency that I need out of solving that problem is totally different than, oh, I'm just tinkering with this thing, I'm playing with it on my own, and I want to understand it more deeply, and I want to be able to like make it more valuable to me or something to that effect. So yeah, I just think that like it's like our audiences are totally different. It's like the Python docs are always going to feel different than Urbit documentation. Surely that'll change as people like build actual businesses, and it becomes, I do think Urbit will end up having like a rich enough ecosystem that there will be people who are like just trying to get stuff done because they're shipping things to Urbit as a platform. But I don't know. I just think it's different. It's like, yeah, it's like kind of a, that's my
yeah, definitely feels different.
It's just different.
Yeah.
I don't know.
You can tell. Yeah, that's right. All right, so so Tlon and Urbit, for a long time, these have pretty much been, often used interchangeably.
Yeah.
Right. We're kind of getting to a point where they're, I wouldn't say diverging, but at least like differentiating a bit. Tlon seems like it's sort of stepping into its own into its own voice, its own, I hesitate to say the word brand, but it's not just a website with some faces on it anymore.
Yep.
Like what's the vision for Tlon? Like we know Urbit is going somewhere, and its vision is pretty much about the same the whole time. But Tlon, tell me about it.
Yeah, sure. So you might be, I mean, one way to think about it might be that like my interest is just in building like exceptionally high quality digital tools for people, and my the kind of original intuition or inspiration or whatever was, and maybe it's more like the original problem was that there really wasn't an existing platform on which you could do that when it came to kind of like everyday cloud-based computing. So even like, what we use Landscape for, I can just send messages, write, whatever. The reality is like, well, do you have an alternative where this actually belongs to you? And the answer is like, not really. There are decentralized networks, they kind of work. There are privacy protecting things, but that doesn't actually belong to you. It's not yours. And so I think that the space of can we make things that connect people digitally that are as high quality as I always think of it in terms of like basically shop tools, So when you go make something in a wood shop or a metal shop or whatever, all that stuff is up to you to figure out what to do with it. I know the problem with this is that like, yeah, most people don't know how to use a shop. I get that. Think of it like a car, at least until recently. This is also like breaks down. It's like for the most part, up until whatever, 20 years ago, car belongs to you. You can take it apart. You can do whatever you want with it. Most people don't. But the fact that it's yours is part of what makes it feel like a really high quality thing. You can do whatever you want with it. The other metaphor I use, it sort of breaks down, is like the home, right? It's like I have my own house. I can arrange the furniture the way that I like. I make it my own. I can like shape my environment. So I think of like there's a huge space of it's like wide open because no one else is working on it. Of like basically just like make purpose-built digital tools for people that can be theirs in the same way that their furniture belongs to them or their car belongs to them or whatever, and let them like be able to live a kind of like digitally minimal lifestyle where these things actually like just are purpose built. They fade into the background. They work. They're like not noticeable. They're not loud. They're not suspicious. They're not annoying. And so that to me is like, I'm like, Tlon should make those things because I do think that's something that people actually need. I think it has the potential to impact the world in really fantastic ways. But actually, Tlon only does that on top of Urbit because Urbit's the only thing that can satisfy most of those conditions. In a way, you can think of also like maybe some of the ethos or this kind of like general way of thinking is embedded in like Urbit uses Ethereum because we just want you to be able to own your ID and we don't particularly need to invent a blockchain. So where I think of like Urbit is this particular sort of, this specific piece of technology that does a bunch of important things. I think of Tlon as being kind of trying to solve the individual like user experience problem, which is like create, I don't know. Yeah, it's funny. And you asked me, I'm like, I've never really thought of like Tlon needs its own concrete vision statement, but it's like what Tlon should deliver is basically fantastic user experience in the digital world, which I would argue just like doesn't exist. I actually don't think it exists. I think it existed in single player mode. Like the Apple II, that Apple II is amazing. It's fantastic. It does exactly what it says it should do. For personal computing, single player personal computing, mostly a solved problem. It's pretty good. Networked personal computing, totally unsolved. User experience doesn't make any sense. No one has figured this out. And so that's like what Tlon does. I think Urbit as a piece of technology has other possible applications as well, outside of just make this really useful to people, which is great. And we happen to own, Tlon obviously owns a lot of Urbit address space, and we want to encourage that to be totally independent and for people to explore what's possible with it. Uh, yeah, I mean, that's the other part of it, of course, is that it's important to mention. People are always like, well, how do you make money? I'm like, well, yeah, we helped in large part develop this platform. We own a large piece of that platform. You can think of us at first like a real estate investment trust. We have a
Mm-hmm.
large portion of this thing, and we are incentivized basically to make it useful. That stuff only has
Yeah.
value if it's useful to people. And I think as the value of address-based sort of stabilizes and as Urbit becomes more mature and more widely distributed, the way that we make money and continue to move forward on what I was talking about before, on just like providing a great user experience, is probably in the form of services of all different kinds. You
Mm-hmm.
maybe obviously you pay us for hosting, maybe you pay us to help you. I mean, who knows what we sell software on Urbit. You pay us to help you develop something for Urbit.
Mm-hmm.
Or we build hardware that you log into with your Urbit ID, but it does something else. I mean, I think
Yeah.
there's a long road ahead.
Yeah. You mentioned fantastic user experience a number of times. And
Yeah.
like, what are the qualities of that? I think ownership must be one of them, which you had in single player mode because, you were a single player, but obviously it breaks down in our networked world, or at least what
Yeah.
we have today. Is that it? Or what other qualities of fantastic user experience need to be built that require Urbit?
Yeah. So I think that the thing that networked computing does is that our it makes like physical communities um, on par with non-physical ones, right? If we're not geographically connected, all of a sudden we can actually be still quite connected. Like, we're not in the same place right
Mm-hmm.
now, but we can effectively be in a community together because we work together, right?
Mm-hmm.
So long term, historically, the way that we organize ourselves is basically only about physical proximity. And all of our affordances for doing that are these completely invisible things. We don't even think about them. This is basically what, for the most part, this is architecture writ large, right? Buildings do
Mm-hmm.
this, roads do this, cities do this, furniture does this, so on and so forth. This is like how we organize our lives. You want the digital world to be as basically unremarkable, like our digital tools to be totally unremarkable in the same way that most of the tools that we build cities are. I think most people want this to be the case, but you can't actually live that way, right? To have this call, we're using, like, my screen is just horrific. Like, I mean, from my perspective, like what I'm looking at right now, like all this, so much bullshit, it's crazy.
Live
Uh,
stream crap. Yeah.
yeah, it's just so stupid. Like,
Yeah.
and so I think that when I look at, it's obviously much more than just, okay, what's pictures behind glass? Okay, we can make pictures behind glass much better. You can also make the way that I interact with, I walk up to the door, I have to like open something behind glass and push something behind glass to make something else work. And of course, there's some server in between there. It's stupid. Like, just, I mean, like, I'm carrying a million chips with me. Really? Like, these chips can't just communicate with each other and do stuff? Well, yeah, because the technology is broken. My car doesn't know that it's me. My house doesn't know that it's me. There's all, like, I mean, the physical world in general, it's like the physical world is not wired because we have no platform to wire it. So I guess it's like, obviously, we're working on a very specific problem, which is much more on the realm of just how do people send messages back and forth and do business, collaborate. And I think there's plenty of stuff there that can be just ruthlessly simplified. Just make it simpler. I think people actually want it to be simpler because they want technology to get
Mm-hmm.
out of the way. They don't want to notice technology. Technology should be
Yep.
invisible. So we already know that people want to
Mm-hmm.
form these non-geographically contiguous communities. That's never going away. We need, that's part of culture. But we've got to be able to do that in ways that are just like, you barely know that it exists. It's like actually an extension of your nervous system with no introduction of some other, kind of like exploit. I mean, not even, I'm obviously like, well, this is another, I mean exploitative, not in the sense that someone's like advertising to you or spying on you. Yeah, sure, that stuff sucks, but that's not the problem. It's just annoying. and weird, and it doesn't feel good.
Mm.
And I think that's what concerns me more, is you want to let people shape these things however they want. Make it like reflect the people that use it, and see what that's even like. Like, we don't even know what that's like. So you could also think of it, I mean, another thing I often think about when it comes to like, well, we can go down, I mean, you can talk about in terms of how do I interact with my city government? How do I interact with information and news? How do researchers collaborate with one another and digest information? Like, there are intermediaries in all of these cases that are insanely difficult to remove or even imagine removing if you're using the existing technology stack. And it's hard. I don't know. For me, it's like that's something that's like once you see that, you kind of can't unsee it. You're like, oh, fuck. It's so much
Yeah.
stuff to
Yeah.
fix.
Yeah. Just no way to get through it all.
Well, it's just like it's gated, right? It's like you're like, look, you could. I think we like live in an age of like sort of extreme. Uh, uh, there's a real sort of fever pitch to people's sense of unease and uncertainty, or something like that, like is my sense of it. And my feeling is that a lot of that is, it's impossible to tell whether or not any of that is real or not real, because the way that people interact with information and each other is not, warped, basically. Like there's always something in between, it's like there's something in between mediating why I get to see what I see or how I talk to someone else. It's like, look, what would the world be like if people just were able to connect directly, however they saw fit? We're able to, orchestrate their devices however they wanted to. We have no idea. Although I would say, my sense is like, actually, it'd probably be a lot like before all of this shit existed, because people were living the way that they were living for thousands of years. Like, humanity is a very robust, wonderful, incredible, dynamic thing. We've ended up in this sort of strange warped reality.
Yeah, I think that's this tension that I often see, somewhat weirdly, but this conversation makes it seem maybe less, which is I've noticed, I think within Tlon and within the Urbit community at large, there's this tendency to like just really viciously hate on computers, and what we've gotten out of them. Yet here we are, like building a computer.
Yeah.
It's like, how do you reconcile those things?
Oh yeah,
but I think there was just a conversation yesterday about, like, God, I can't, I'm looking forward to there being no more computers. But here we all are. What's up with that? What do you think?
Well, I think it's like, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's just what I was saying before. It's like, it does seem conceivable that you could make computers very unnoticeable. They just wouldn't be that important anymore. They'd be this kind of background layer of connectivity or something like that.
Yeah, we can just take them for granted, without them having to occupy the front of our minds.
I mean, books are, I don't know why it's like, this is amazing technology. Like, this is insane. Like, this thing is incredible. You don't even think about it, right? This changed the way that people think and the way the world is organized. No one cares about this. It's just a book, like, that's what technology should be like. And I think that's like, new technology is exciting and wild, and it's understandable that it has that effect, like, to some extent. But I feel like the project is like, look, let's get it back to the sort of normal way that we deal with new technologies, that we make them into infrastructure. It's widely distributed, that everybody has, everyone has some, like, all cultures have some agency over, no one like controls building. It's not like there's like the central building authority producer. So like only, if you want to build a building in Italy, like you have to get your materials from them or something.
Yep. I mean, that was, I was recently in in Brazil in this little mountain town. And, prior to this, I was working on a company that was building buildings in San Francisco. And the contrast between what you have to do to build a building in San Francisco and what you have to do to build a building in the mountains of Brazil is quite different. There you just like stack some bricks and, in a square and put some stuff in the building and run some water down from the hill and boom, there you got your building. You don't have to check with anybody. No one cares. Just build your building.
Yeah.
San Francisco, like Jesus, is your window the right size? Everything, every little detail.
It's awesome. Like they're different cultures, right? We have different values about like San Francisco buildings are capital, like it's controlled by this big armature that we all to some extent believe in about how this stuff should be managed and why it benefits the whole in particular ways. And so we manage it in a particular way. And yeah, it's wonderful that then you can go somewhere else and it can be completely different. But like the fact that, you're in Brazil and like and everybody in Brazil just still uses Facebook or whatever, it's like, that's super weird. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah. No, it doesn't. They actually were telling me some family they were telling us the story of, I think it was Orkut before. And how that was actually something that they really used and liked. And no one was particularly happy about the fact that disappeared and got replaced with with what we have now.
Orkut's such a good one, or like funny story, because from I remember it wasn't a great product by my standard, or but I get why people didn't use it in the culture I was around, or why people migrated to other things. But yeah, it's tragic that then whoever did find it useful for whatever reason, which is great, obviously should have just been able to keep it and keep using it and take it over and develop it and make it their own. Why not? That would make complete sense. Yeah, it can be fixed. It's just, takes time.
Yeah, working on it.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool, man.
All right, well, we can turn this around next time. Thanks for being
sounds good. This was fun.
Mike Wallace.
It was fun. I wanted to know the answers to a lot of these questions, so.
Oh, good. That's actually what I always find is I'm like, it's somewhat embarrassing, but I'm like, oh, we've worked together for years. Like, tell me about why you work on Urbit. And I'm like, wow, that's crazy.
It's amazing that I don't already know this. But here we are.
Yeah.
So.
That's true. All right. Well, yeah.
All right.
This
good shit. Cool.
Yeah. I'll talk to you soon.
Yes, you will. All right. Have a good weekend.
Yeah.